everyone. Welcome to a new series we're starting this weekend titled It's Not Just You. Loss and grief can really isolate. It can make us feel as if we're the only one going through what we're going through. And while grief is intentionally personal, there are 7 billion people in the world. That means there are really 7 billion different ways to go through grief. There are some principles that are transferable across all lives and how to deal with loss and grief. And in this season where a lot has been lost, we're going to talk about this for 2 months. Take a look at this story from Southbrooker Gary O'Brien, including his son Keegan, and how Gary has leveraged his talents to put his life in play for those who are in need.
Started working at the Hyatt in Cincinnati in 1985, when it was really the gem in the hotels in downtown Cincinnati. We did the World Series. George Bush won. We cooked for him. Rock stars, they would bring him through the basement of the hotel. It was just a really great place to be at the time. Cincinnati actually had more 4- and 5-star restaurants per capita than New York or San Francisco. And no matter how great my sales were, my product costs, or how many, bata boys we got after a banquet, it just kind of felt hollow. Yes, I cooked for presidents and rock stars and those people, but sometimes you have to take a step back and realize that God's given me this talent. How can I best utilize it?
As a career technical school, we have run adult programs in hospitality and culinary arts. We help students get their high school equivalencies through a variety of ways. I have seen their lives improve. I've watched their children grow up and their lives have been improved. And I've now been able to see their grandchildren and how that's impacted the whole family for generations. We were seeking someone to be our chef, and Gary applied. Lucky us.
It's really interesting that when we start off, they're very much kind of at a distance. By the time we're done, we're all one big happy family.
He works well with all students and earns their trust and loyalty and really takes them somewhere else.
Well, with COVID hitting and everybody kind of taking a big step back, it really just magnified the kind of food desert that we have here.
COVID was really the crisis that gave us the opportunity to look at things differently and see how can we reach people when we've been told that we can't do it the traditional way.
Really put our thinking caps on about what we could do to make an impact. So that's where we came up with the idea to take and start to produce meals here. We have a partnership with one of the local food distributors. So we get a 24-foot truck that comes in every Tuesday. When the food comes in, it's sort of like chopped with a truck. We never know what we're going to get. We don't go to the grocery store. We don't buy things in. We go with what the good Lord blesses us with. My son, Keegan, he is just a heart of gold, will jump in and do anything.
He said, come here and let's start cooking. So I just jumped right in and helped him.
And our students, under Gary's direction, would prepare meals, really amazing meals.
It's not like your average peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
So we went from doing 75 meals a week to doing about 500 a week.
It's really taken us out of something good into something so much better, with so much more impact. We wouldn't be in the same place if it wasn't for Gary and his view of the world and his mission, his own personal mission that he brings to his job.
Cooking for the presidents and everybody else, those are all great people, but the ones that write you a thank you that you've changed their lives or you've made a difference, those are the ones that stick.
Sometimes on this journey, I get lost in my mistakes. What looks to me like weakness is a canvas for your strength. My story isn't over, my story's just begun. And failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house.
Arrival's not the end game, the journey's where you are. Never wanted perfect, you just wanted my heart. And the story isn't over if the story isn't good. And failure's never final when the Father's in the room. The failure's never final when the Father's in the room.
Lay your burdens down. Here in the Father's house, check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house.
Prodigals come home, the helpless find hope. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Prison doors fling wide, the dead come to life. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room.
Miracles take place, the cynical find faith, and love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Jericho walls are quaking, strongholds now are shaking, and love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Oh, love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Oh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, here in the Father's house, check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, here in the Father's house, check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house.
For the next 2 months, we hope you lay your burdens down. Grief is not something, as we will learn, to recover from necessarily. It's a part of life, and it's something in which we find God. Sherry and I have been involved in 2 churches in our lifetime, and one was right out of college, and it was in northern Kentucky. We were there 7 years, loved the people, small church, and they loved us. And Sherry and I are very different. I love change, she doesn't. I'm a roller coaster person. She's a merry-go-round person. She wants it predictable. I want it unpredictable. And the time came where, to use a theological way of putting it, we sensed God was calling us to Dayton, Ohio, at this new church that had been started. And we moved to Centerville in January of 1992, and Sherry grieved that. She wrote in her journal, "How in the world could I leave these people who had been so loyal to us?" At first I said I simply wouldn't do it. He could go to Dayton and I was going to stay in Kentucky. And then after much prayer, I accepted the idea of the move, but I grieved long and loudly for the people I was letting go. And then I found myself hanging somewhere in the middle. Grief always feels like you're hanging somewhere in the middle. We had resigned in Kentucky, but we hadn't moved to Dayton yet, and the weeks before the move were grueling. I knew with the change came the hope of new relationships that would replace the ones I was losing, but they weren't yet formed, and I was dangling between the old and the new. I was dangling between the old and the new. And that's a descriptor of grief and loss. I remember the first week after I had started working here, and I came home after being at our office on Franklin Street, being there all day, very excited, this new church with new opportunities and fresh start. And I went to the apartment where we were living off of Franklin Street here in Centerville, and Sherry was standing at the kitchen sink. My wife is not a crier at all. And she was weeping. She was weeping deeply. And I so excited. Here, Mr. Roller Coaster, who's loving this new ride I'm on, and it's a wonderful time for me. I said, what's wrong? And she said, it's just hit me, all the relationships I've lost. And she listed some of the people, Brad and Cheryl and Ed and Joe, and a number of people whose relationships wouldn't be the same. And with all the compassion I could muster, I looked at her and I said, "You still have me." And that didn't help. That didn't help the situation any. Because grief, you see, is not about what you still have. It's about what you've lost. In essence, if you could put it down to its lowest common denominators, life is love. That's what it's all about. These remain faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. But life is loss. To live is to lose. It is. The number one aspect of church leadership that I underestimated was the constant loss. I did not see that coming when I started 35 years ago. I didn't see this immense, constant loss through defections, through defeat, and through death. Yet those three realities would be a part of my life, and I can't say I've always processed it well. And in part, I need this series. This series for me is, as it always with loss and grief is, an important growth element. Physician, heal thyself. You see, there's all kinds of loss. Here's the way I'll describe it. In this season of COVID, one of the reasons we have to deal with this is because some of us, for example, on what we might scale the lowest level loss is what I would call paces, rhythms. Our rhythms have been disrupted, and some of the predictable rhythms and schedules of our past are gone, at least right now. Another level is paths, directions in life have changed. And we did have this job, now that job's gone. We had this schedule, and that schedule's gone. And there's a loss in that. Amping it up more would be the loss of possessions. Anyone who has ever had a house burned down where all their possessions were consumed by the raging fire know the oddity of losing valued possessions. And as you can see on the screen, this includes pets. This includes pets. For many of you, as we'll see with grief, it is so individual that you would put this higher on the scale when it comes to pets. Then there's loss of places. Places we used to frequent, places we used to visit. For a long time, we couldn't even visit loved ones. One of the things, ashamedly, that prompted this series in me was when I knew I wasn't going to be going to Ohio Stadium this fall. And we say, well, that's football, that's a game, but it's about family. It's about the loss of place, tailgating with family. And then, of course, there's the big loss. The loss that is like no other loss, that's the loss of people. Because life is love. And to love is to lose. I underestimated this about life. And I might scale it this way. Look on the screen as you can look at this graph that we came up with, that the most difficult level of loss, people, is going to take the most time. It is going to take the most time to recover from. And usually the loss of pace and rhythm is something that is disruptive. Sometimes it is a in-between space where we need to let go of this past rhythm, this past schedule, this past pace, and we need to move on to the new. It usually doesn't have the same time and pain elements to it. My point with this is there are 7 billion people in the world. That means there are 7 billion different ways to process grief. Those of you who have lost pets know that the loss of that dear pet was like losing a person. Look at these words from Romans chapter 8, verse 22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning. In the year 2020, we felt that groaning, haven't we? We felt the loss of paces. We felt the loss of paths and possessions, and we certainly felt the loss of places and people. In this whole creation, the writer, Paul says, has been groaning. We've heard those groans this year. The title of this message today is This Life is as Crazy as You Think It Is. And that's really just another way to say what Paul's saying in Romans 8:22, that this world isn't right. It is groaning. This virus called sin entered the world and it upset the cosmic reality, the cosmic balance. God made everything and He saw that it was good, and then sin entered the picture, and this world is as crazy as it feels right now. This world is not just crazy to you. It's not just you. It really is crazy. It really is groaning. That the default reality of this world is not hip-hop happy day. The default reality in this broken world is groaning. That doesn't mean this isn't a wonderful world, as Louis Armstrong famously sang. It is. It's full of so much beauty and hope and renewal and love and joy, and life is amazing. But the reality is, even in the context of our happiest moments, we know there is the specter of groaning. Paul goes on in verse 22 and he says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. As in the pains of childbirth. Paul's using a picture that Jesus used in John 16 when He said, in a little while you will see me no more. You're going to lose me. And then after a little while, you will see me. That summarizes life, that life is loss, and yet there's this hope. And He says that to them, and He says, very truly, I tell you, you will weep, and you will mourn while the world rejoices. There are people who were happy that Jesus was gone. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes this world doesn't know really what it's asking for. You'll grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. Right there, Jesus is saying this grief that we experience in this life is so deep and so dark, and yet not only does groaning contextualize joy, the reality is that hope casts an even bigger light over the specter of grief. One of the interesting things about grief is that you're deep in grief right now. You don't want to hear that. Isn't that interesting? One of the books I've enjoyed reading this summer is a book by Megan Devine called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And she talks about how she did not want to hear about hope. She didn't. She didn't want to hear about joy. She didn't want to hear about everything has a reason. But one of the aspects of grief that is so important is even though you're listening to the sound of my voice, and if you're deep in loss, you may not want to hear this. I love what Bob Goff said. He said, over-communicate hope. Over-communicate hope. In other words, that there has to be this reminder that even though right now I feel like I'm dangling between that which was and that which may be, we still need to hang on to hope. And this picture of a childbirth, I remember back in the day when our kids were born, the class required me, the birthing class, to help Sherry breathe. Now, I always thought that was strange because it's something she'd pretty much been doing her whole life. But when she was in discomfort, it wasn't pain, you weren't supposed to call it pain. She was in discomfort, I was going to help her breathe. And how that was going to help an object the size of a bowling ball come out of her body, I still to this day don't understand. But for instance, Austin was 11 pounds, 2 ounces when he was born. There is no breathing coaching on the planet that could have helped that. But yet, when our daughter and son came, it was like that pain never happened. And Jesus said, that's, in a world that groans, that's this reality. Paul goes on to say in Romans 8:24, not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits, the down payment, the initial experience of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, to daughtership, to being children of the Father, the redemption of our bodies, our being, mind, body, and spirit. Look at that. He says, it's not just you that you're struggling so deeply, and it's not just you that you don't have enough faith, you don't have enough trust. If your faith was stronger, you wouldn't hurt so deeply. No. He says, those of us who have the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait for this consummation. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. But who hopes for what they already have? Who hopes for what they already have? We hope for what we do not yet have. And we wait for it patiently. That's such a key word right now in this COVID context, is we wait patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We don't know what we ought to pray for. If you've ever been into deep grief, that is so true. There are times when you don't know what to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. I can tell you one of the lowest points of my life was back in the early 2000s, and I was so fed up with ministry that the Bible that I had been given when I was ordained into ministry, one day in my office, I premeditatively, carefully, surgically tore it to shreds. That's right. I committed what you Catholics feel is an unforgivable sin, and that I actually took that Bible and I said, God, I have had enough. I still to this day, I want to write a book the day I shredded my Bible, because it was probably the most honest I've ever been with God. As I now look back and know the Spirit was interceding for me through wordless groans, my spirit was groaning. And you can debate whether or not I should have shredded my Bible, but God searches our heart, He says in verse 24. He wants to get to that core of our being. He knows the mind of the Spirit because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. Isn't that amazing? I'm so encouraged by that, because when you are shredding your Bible, you don't know what you ought to pray for. And I know some of you who are listening to this right now, you want to shred your Bible. While we're groaning, what are we supposed to do? As we begin this series, here's what I want to offer you. I want to offer that you just as honestly, and if it takes shredding your Bible to do it, as honestly as you can, you turned to your Father's house. In Scripture, the house of God is always the place where God's presence is available and experienced. That can be in your basement, it can be in a prayer closet, it can be in a field. Turn to the God who groans with you. And then there's this amazing verse that I want to say something about this that you may not expect me to say, Romans 8:28, that he says, and as we do that, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. I want to say that because in part that's true. But I want to remind you too that every one of us ought to raise our right hand and swear we will never quote that verse at a funeral home again. Because that verse, while true, is possibly the worst verse you can quote to someone who's in grief and loss. Well, you know, God has a plan. And we're going to speak into that in this series, that we have this tension of we hold on to hope. And yet, we don't need someone preaching at us. We just need, in our own way, to be honest in our groans and turn to the God that we know that there is a light there. There is a tiny speck of light there that speaks into a transcendent hope. You see, God's ultimate answer to a world of love and loss wasn't an explanation. It wasn't. He never gave Job a reason for his loss. Do you know that? God replaced Job in his grief and loss with so many incredible things, including children. But He never tried to explain Himself. God's ultimate answer to a world of love and loss wasn't an explanation. It was the incarnation. He came as a man acquainted with sorrow and grief, the Scriptures say, who bore our sorrow. God came to show that He is not a distant Buddha sitting with legs and arms crossed, separated from our pain, distant from our difficulty. The incarnation says He became us. As John says in John 1:14, He pitched His tent in our camp and became one of us. Corrie ten Boom wrote these words from the depths of the Nazi death camp: no matter how deep the darkness is right now, He is deeper still. You see, grief is not something to overcome. As painful as that may be to hear, grief is not something to recover from. Grief is life. Because life is love, and to love is to lose, and to grieve is to experience a reality of this world where we are most likely to find God when we're shredding our Bibles. I love these words from 1 Thessalonians 4:13. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who has no hope. In the next 2 months, we're going to learn how to grieve, but not like those who have no hope. And we hope you join us.
Sometimes on this journey, I get lost in my mistakes. but looks to me like weakness is a canvas for your strength. My story isn't over, my story's just begun. And failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does.